It's always wise to never leave the script, but I'm going to do it right off the very top. Bob, I wonder sometimes if the superintendent had the same feeling going to your classroom as you had inviting him, that he wasn't sure exactly what he was going to see or knew exactly what to expect either. It's great to be back with you. I haven't been here in like 7 days, and so little has changed, but anyway, it's great to be here. Among the most famous, among the most recognizable, among the most quoted figures of the 20th century was British Prime Minister Winston Churchill. And my favorite Churchill quotes include this one: "Politics is more dangerous than war, because in war they only kill you once." Or this one: "A fanatic is a man who won't change his mind and can't seem to change the subject." He's also quoted, maybe even more famously quoted, as saying that Britain would never, never, never surrender. Truth be told, he never said that. He never said that. It's not exactly what he said anyway, but it is just as surely what he meant. If you ever get a chance to listen to that speech in its entirety, you'll certainly note how often the word never is used. And so once all is said and done, Churchill's response to the Nazi threat on Britain was absolutely never. You know, in almost any language, to repeat a word or to repeat a phrase is a way to signal its importance. Every child knows this, right? We hear it when they tell us that they really, 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 really want something. And when they ask if they could have it, please, 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 please. Well, that's the way language works, and so it is. We'll find it working this way in Scripture. Take, for example, Isaiah chapter 6 or Revelation chapter 4, where we hear that God is holy, holy, holy. Now, it's just not saying that God is holy, though it certainly is, but it's noting that and driving home the idea that holiness is an essential mark of God's very being. And as we take a look at our passage this morning, Matthew 28, I want you to note that there are 3 commands given in the scripture that was read by the angel, but soon followed up in verses 9 and 10 by Jesus. And it's a relatively short story, but it's an action-packed story. And each of these commands is, I think, repeated. And repeated for emphasis. And repeated so that you and I, 2,000 years later, won't forget any of them. And these commands, I believe, are what lie at the heart of the good news. And rests at the heart of what it means to follow Jesus. Even today, even here, even amid all the chaos that we've been living in and living through. Not only are they still in effect, but they're very, very, very important. They're really, really, really essential. The first command: don't be afraid. This command is probably one of the most repeated commands in all of Scripture. And we usually find it when God shows up in a really powerful way, in a really dire circumstance, in a time of great trouble. It's even a favorite of Matthew's. It appears repeatedly in his gospel. We find it right off the very top when the angel meets with Joseph. talks to him about his seemingly unfaithful fiancée and the awful place that she seems to have put him in. But Jesus himself issues this command a little bit later in chapter 14 when he says this to his disciples amid the storm, when he walks out to them on the water. You know, in each of these circumstances, being afraid, even just a little bit, is pretty reasonable. Both the angel and later on Jesus start out by saying, don't be afraid. In the face of naturally terrifying experiences, they are encouraged, maybe even commanded, not to be afraid. But what they see and what they're confronted by is certainly not what they expected, and certainly not what they signed up for. Right, in the first instance, when they arrive at the tomb, they expect to arrive at a quiet tomb in a peaceful garden, to tend to a body that they imagine will just lie there and mind its own business. But this picture of tranquility is certainly not what they arrive to. In the second instance, the next man that the women expected to see was likely one of the disciples. And they weren't even going to be ready to see them yet. But what they see instead, what greets them on the road as they hurry along, is the walking dead, a ghost, a zombie, it seems. And at the very least, each incident would have caught them off guard, would have caught them by surprise. And more likely, when they came upon each instance, was something more than just unexpected. It was something shocking, right? An earthquake, an empty tomb, a conversation with an angelic being, soldiers passed out on the ground, a man that they themselves watched die, an agonizing death just hours before, a man that they themselves watched being placed in the tomb. And so naturally, the command to not be afraid fits. It's timely. It makes sense in this situation. But why is it so important that they not be afraid? Well, just as was the case in this scene, God, the good God, the loving God, the merciful God, was working for their good. And maybe even through this seeming chaos. But the second reason is pretty important as well. That it sets the stage for commands 2 and commands 3. Come and see. Knowing what the women had come to see, to tend to Jesus' body, and knowing what they were witnessing, and knowing what he had just told them seemed unbelievable, still the angel says to the women, come and see. Now these women were pretty sure that they knew where Jesus' body ought to be. After all, they had not only watched the horror of the crucifixion, but they were there, Scripture tells us, when Joseph of Arimathea lays this body in the tomb and when he rolls the big rock over the doorway. They had seen it all. They had witnessed it themselves. They knew what was supposed to be where. And interestingly enough, no one else, not even Jesus' closest disciples, witnessed the fullness of the stark reality of the crucifixion, of the death of Jesus, as much as these women did. And so fittingly, I think fittingly, as they sought to continue their vigil from cross to the tomb, these women had not left Jesus ever during his darkest hour. And they would be there to witness the evidence of the resurrection, his most glorious hour. You know, it's interesting to me, if you look closely at this text, before the women run off as they've been commanded to do, even though they've been invited to come and see, to examine all the evidence, to examine the tomb, to examine the cloths, it doesn't seem like they ever actually do. Then after that, as they hurry on their way, the women meet Jesus. And more by his posture than by his words, he too encourages them to come and to see. He invites them in. Jesus invites them to come near. And the word he uses in the Aramaic, the word here in Greek, is no casual or coy, oh, hi, how are you? Instead, the root of this word is found in the same word that we have for rejoice. Rejoice. And then he welcomes them in. It's a warm welcome. It's a celebratory welcome. It's a welcome that bids them, invites them, encourages them to come near, to come and see. And they do so. And they do so without hesitation. They couldn't come closer than they did. They not only embraced him, but they clinged to him. They cling to him. And in the fury and in the despondency of life that had surrounded them for these last 3 days, and maybe even longer, they grabbed hold of him most tightly. And given who he was, they not only cling to him, but they worship him. The one who is resurrected, and who Scripture tells us is the resurrection. The one who is alive, and that Scripture tells us is the life. You know, we might be tempted to think that this is a great and fitting end to the story. Jesus' most devoted followers, those who stuck with him through thick and thin, especially thick and really thick, that he's reunited with these people. What a great way to end the story. But Jesus isn't satisfied with come and see. And it seems as if the women aren't satisfied with come and see, as great and as wonderful as come and see is. Because the invitation of both the angel and of Jesus to come and see is followed immediately by the command, go and tell. You know, without giving any reason, both the angel and Jesus follow up the invitation to come and see with the command to go and tell. And the angel adds force to this command when he tells them not only to go, but to go quickly. There's an urgency to this mission that he's sending them on. And without hesitation, without question, the women obey. And not only do they leave right away, but Scripture also tells us that they hurried, and even that they ran. In fact, again, they go so quickly that it seems that they take the angel's word about Jesus rising from the dead. And instead of carefully examining the evidence, they simply and quickly turn and go. How quickly do they go? Well, they go so quickly that even as they're going, there's still a mix of emotions. They don't wait to process everything. They don't wait until they have it all figured out. They don't wait until they've figured out what the story is they're going to tell. They don't wait till they have all the answers. They don't wait till they've calmed down. And not only did they hurry, not only did they run, not only were they filled with joy, but Scripture for some reason continues to tell us that they were still afraid. You have to admit that's an odd and pretty rare combination. Joy and fear. But there it is. But they continue to run until they run into Jesus. And while they stop to see Jesus, and while they cling to Jesus, and while they worship Jesus, the story seems to lead us to believe that they only do so for a moment. Because rather than allowing them to settle too comfortably into his presence, Jesus too sends them on their way. Just like the angel before him, Jesus commands these women to go and to tell. But what are they going to tell when they go? Well, it would seem this, that they would go and tell what they had come and seen. That's all. But in a sense, that's not all. They would go and tell that Jesus is alive. That Jesus is alive, that he is risen, and as at Easter we would say, and he is risen indeed, but also that he's looking forward to being with them. Don't be afraid. Come and see. Go and tell. You know, it's almost been 2,000 years since these events. In an obscure garden, in an obscure town, on an obscure kind of day. Yet the commands that both the angel and Jesus to deliver to those followers, those women, continue to call out to us, to me, to you, in your obscure home, in your obscure town, on this otherwise obscure kind of day. Do not be afraid. Some of us, especially during this time of global uncertainty, need to hear maybe again, the exhortation from Jesus, from the angel, don't be afraid. Don't be afraid. After all, Jesus is risen.
He is risen indeed.
And he longs to be with you. And while the world quakes around us, and while others shake around us, and maybe even like the Roman soldiers faint, you need not fear. Jesus is risen.
He's risen indeed.
And he longs to be with you. And even so, just as it was for the two Marys, if you're experiencing in these days fear or doubt or uncertainty or shock or alarm, you need not let it swallow your joy. We learn from this story that even if uncomfortably, or even if only temporarily, fear and joy can exist together. But also don't let your fear, don't let your worry, don't let your doubt or uncertainty or shock or alarm disqualify your ministry and your witness. Right? Both the angel and Jesus were willing to send as the first witnesses of the resurrection some women who were troubled, who were afraid, who were nervous, who didn't have all the answers, even before their fear was fully gone. Jesus received the women and received their worship, even though their questions weren't all answered, and while their fear still lingered. And in turn, Jesus, the Holy One of Israel, was ready to send them, the imperfect, as his chosen instruments of good news. Even though their joy, true joy at the glory and hope of seeing the resurrected Jesus, was still yet mixed a little bit with fear. Don't be afraid, but come and see. Some of us, especially today, even if we already believe in Jesus, need to hear the invitation of Jesus again to come and see. We need to meet, maybe again like the very first time, the resurrected Jesus, the Jesus who is alive, the Jesus who has defeated death, not only for himself, but for us too. The Jesus who greets us, the Jesus who welcomes us in, even as we're running through the chaos that is our lives. And we need to cling to him. We need to cling to him. In the chaos that's been our world, it quakes around us, and many, because of that, are shaking. We need to cling to him tightly. Cling to him as though there is no one else that we love. And cling to him as though he were our only hope. Because he is. And of course, as we're going to get the opportunity to do again in a moment, like the women, we need to worship him. We need to express to him. And we need to express before others, those that we find at his feet with us, and to the listening world, and to the not listening world, where our hope is grounded, that Jesus alone is our source of hope. And so we are not to be afraid. We're to come and see, but also we're to go and tell. All of us, especially today, need to obey unhesitatingly and with urgency the commission to go and to tell. And we need to go and to tell those who will listen, and even those who won't. And we need to tell a lost and chaotic and a fearful world that Jesus is risen, that he has overcome the great enemy, he's overcome death, but not just for himself, but for us too, for them too. We need to tell this to those who will listen, and even to those who won't. And all we have to tell them is what we have seen. That he has met us, even unexpectedly, as we've hurried along the way. And we tell how he's met others. And we will tell him how he wants to meet them too. We need to tell them that even today, Jesus continues to say, don't be afraid. Come and see, especially into this chaotic world. But one of the upsides of this chaotic world is in some way, at least for some people, it is an unprecedented time of openness to big questions. An openness and an interest, even in the message of Jesus Christ that many of us haven't seen before in our lives. And therefore, I'm going to leave you with this charge. It comes from the angelic beings, but comes even from Jesus. The very charge that the angel gave to the women. The very charge that Jesus gave to the women. The very same charge that Scripture, that the Lord continues to give to you and me, to go